The Slave fight that day was the beginning of the War of American Independence. Later that year, in Charleston, overlooking Boston, the Redcoats marched up the hills, walking after the I'll get you. Also, please note the various
you can see the wall.
The turning point had been reached. By this time, the Declaration of Independence had been signed. The British realized that they were in danger. France had aligned herself with the Americans, and Spain gave it.
Not everything the Germans do.
Pans out.
We want somebody. Watch the plane. When you push it, the propeller spins.
Hey, you're seeing something in a movie that looks like that.
Dawn, August 8th.
Right there in the middle of the village.
Aircraft of the Royal Flying
Hey,
Corps are taking
what's
off.
the last thing you got?
National Socialist jacket. Yeah. Look at this one. This is great.
We have to follow the path, man.
30 Years' War.
Aviation was in its infancy. Scarcely 10 years had passed since the first war of flight, but a small number of military visionaries could foresee the limitless potential of the airplane as a weapon. The aircraft became an indispensable observation plane. Enemy activity in the past was completely hidden. It became necessary to deny the enemy the ability to see such. Pilots on both sides were eager and celebrated.
Yeah.
There was a camaraderie, a respect between pilots.
It's cool, isn't it?
Knights of the Air, names like Barker, Bishop, Wickenbacher, both
This is fantastic.
and Rick Philbin have gone down in aviation history as the best of the best. And to this day, their pioneering tactics are still part of military aviation. But by the end of the war, thousands of pilots for both sides had died, including many of the great aces. For those who survived, the youthful exuberance and lust for the fight was gone. Aerial warfare was here to stay, and it would become even more effective and deadly in the years to come. The chivalry and glory of being a man of the air had passed in days under the command of the Duke of Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo.
This is a map that was a German map of the world that they took as a war prize. You can see shipping lines, Zeppelin routes, different areas of occupation and different capitals.
Because the models are what are usually called 20mm scale. Because of their size, are used
Pretty cool.
around in diorama sequence. There are three sizes of these. 20mm, 154. The size of all the others are
In March, the Allies crossed the Rhine into the homeland of the
We're trapped in here.
What is it? I like this Wild West town.
The final leg over the top of the maritime. Here we see a typical world maritime machine. The place that remained the same for over
Oh no, the light's going out.
the railway steams through its
I like all the little burn cannonballs.
conversation prevailed in drawing rooms, taverns, street corners, and the
You go potty, Maddie? This way.
I go potty.
Maddie, this way, I'll take you.
Morgan, how far is the big railway these days? The big railway was, of course, the new Canadian Pacific Railway, which had begun to inch across the prairies in the spring of 1882. In Canada in the 1880s, this was more than just a war. This was the greatest engineering feat the young country had ever undertaken. It was also a political move to stop encroachment by American settlers and politicians into the scantily populated prairie lands. Lastly, It was the last step in a true confederation of Canada from coast to coast. It was simple. No railroad, no Canada. So the Canadian Pacific Railway, lumbering into the towering barrier of British Columbia in late 1883, carried with it the dreams, hopes, and aspirations of a young country. It was also designed to bring immigrants by the tens of thousands to fill out the poorly populated prairies and stop the threat of American takeover. What they didn't realize at the time was that by populating the prairies and providing transportation to eastern and western seaports, they were creating the future breadbasket of the world. Let's take a trip back into history now as we look at the big railway. In this working diorama, here's history in 3 dimensions and accurately scaled. Here are the imagination-defying engineering feats, the way people live, the anguish, the sweat, the toil that went into completing one of the world's mightiest railways over a country that size is beyond comprehension. Over deserts that dry a man's brain, and towering passes where winds howl at 100 miles an hour, and temperatures plummet to 40 below zero. Muskie that can swallow a train without a trace, and yawning chasms a mile deep that had to be crossed. This track was the first train ever to cross Canada, pulled into Granville Station in 1887 with its founders, Smith and Van Horn aboard. Here's the gaily garlanded train being greeted by thousands of spectators, the people of Vancouver, no longer isolated from the east. Imagine the excitement, the wonder of the crowd as they looked in awe at this bedecked locomotive that had towed passengers and cargo all the way across Canada. In 1887, that was definitely the equivalent to our astronauts on the moon. Adjacent to the station was Granville, known locally as Gastown, after its leading citizen, ex-ship's captain and saloon keeper, Gassy Jack Dayton. Gastown was destroyed twice by fire, and each time rebuilt under the urgings of this redoubtable character. The fact that the train was sitting in Granville Station was indeed a miracle, with the obstacles it had to overcome or examine. For instance, along the side of the tracks you can see the sawmills it had to build to create its own railroad ties and trestle. In fact, these sawmills turned out millions of board feet to keep the track layers supplied. Rather than drag explosives, especially volatile nitroglycerin, all the way from the east, the railway built explosive factories at the construction site. Thousands of pounds of it went into carving enormous tunnels through million-year-old granite. Although equipment, lumber, and tools were vital, none were so necessary as manpower. Thousands of men were needed to push the railway ahead. And just as today in pipeline construction, these men were a tough and mixed group. Men who slaved for 10 hours a day, and on their time off, played just as rough. Yale, BC was the focal point for the railway for years, and each night it would resound to the roar of railway men letting off their steam. Huge Irish giants fleeing from the potato famine, wiry, indestructible Chinese coolies from Peking, Shantung, and Hong Kong, burly Russians who had helped build the Trans-Siberian Railroad, all thrown together in an effort to cross the country with a ribbon of steel. Villages became towns, and towns became cities. Calgary in 1883 was a makeshift city of shacks and tents on the east bank of the Elbow River. Such was the power of the railway that when it came over the west bank, an entire city followed its example, and the new city of Calgary started upwards on the western bank of the Elbow. In Saskatchewan, too, the railway had no intention of diverting their line up to meet the town of Battleford, whose citizens were determined to make it the capital. Instead, the railway built a town at the old wagon crossing of Wascana and asked Princess Louise to name the town. She chose Regina in honor of her lover, Queen Victoria. Winnipeg had grown without the help of the railway. Its location made it the jumping point to the west, the gateway to the prairie.
Mommy, come here.
In the summer of 1940, Hitler was planning to invade England. Before the German invasion forces could cross the English Channel, the Royal Air Force had to be driven from the skies. From bases in occupied France, the Luftwaffe set forth to destroy the Royal Air Force on the ground and in the air. Reich Marshal Goering had promised that the RAF would last 4 weeks. The Battle of Britain had begun, and Germany's first defeat of the Second World War was at hand. Throughout August and September of 1940, the RAF, against overwhelming odds, stood fast and devastated the German Air Force. Flying the famous Spitfire and Hurricane aircraft, less than 1,000 pilots defended Britain in one of the most remarkable air battles of all time. Every day, hundreds of German fighters and bombers would rise up from France and head for Italy. They would be met by the Spitfires and Hurricanes of the RAF, and an intense duel in the skies above England would ensue. Often, the beleaguered RAF pilots would land to refuel and rearm, and then spread through the air. Engaging the wave of attacking bombers. On September 17, 1940, with the RAF still in the skies above England, was spoken until the invasion of England occurred in late September. The pilots, their planes, and the job they performed in those 2 months in 1940 have become legendary. And Britain will forever.
Anything throughout the world, you're not going to figure out who I'm talking about and where it is their constant challenges and motivation. I'm turning the tide of the world war by their promise and by their word. Never let it be.
Start the airplanes. Let the airplanes go.
Western Europe.
Earlier, German generals Rommel and von Rundstedt had disagreed over defensive action. Rommel wanted to repel the invasion at the beachhead, and von Rundstedt favored a defense that could prove its intensity as the invasion forces moved inland. A compromise, though, and German heavy armor was left well to the south, a plan that allowed rapid, if short-lived advancement by the Allies. In addition, several Nazi tank divisions could only move in with direct word from the front. It was not until the morning of the 7th that panzer leaders received their orders.
Ooh, this is fine.
Men also found gold in BC, but in no great quantity.
On either side of the German divisions had been found eyewitnesses and intelligent demonstrated history by the gold as incident to a German
The famous Caribou stage line, the BZ Express Company in Amsterdam, and the Bank of British North America from Apple. This was the history of British Columbia, and these were the times
What is this? Jack and the Beans? Can you let me out? I want to see the top.
Or bad fairies running through the towers of the magic broomstick. This castle, with its towers
Oh, I see! A lamp!
is the signature of years of painstaking work.
I
Okay, guys, come here.
Actually get to see just what she did along with. Don't forget that Mouse family. Remember, they did the heat of the show. Santa's workshop. The other 364 days of the year. Incredible.
Can you see the things that he's
The Great London. कमाल का चीज निंदर की बात मानते हैं सुखी ने कहा था मत जाना निंदर ने कहा था जाना सुखी ने तो पहले जिस दिन देखी नहीं मुझे नहीं लगता होता ही है
On the edge of the city, industry settles in and establishes itself as an important component in the continued growth and strength of the city. In the distance, a refinery processes the important fuels an industrial society requires to supply planes, power machines, heat our homes. As the industrial park expands, new construction begins on yet another facility. The tradesmen are building a complex that will impose even more.
That's alright, that's alright.
Along the passage, his opponent, whom he helped get back on his horse, was Arthur, the king he had come to swear allegiance to.
I like that one.
Soon, Lancelot would become Arthur's most trusted and capable knight. Arthur would invite him to take his rightful place at the round table. Arthur had married the beautiful Guinevere early in his rule. When Sir Lancelot persevered, he was helped from the battlefield by Sir Bedivere. Even before the Battle of Canlan, Arthur had watched his kingdom fall into decline. The one thing that he believed would restore